What's up guys, Asian here again with another sort of theory crafting video. This is kind of a little bit related to also builds as well. This is sort of the theory crafting behind the theory crafting of builds, and you can kind of think of this as the meta theory crafting, so to speak. So this particular video, as the title says, is just kind of thinking about buffs and debuffs and how to make your build around these buffs and debuffs. And this is actually a fairly controversial topic for some odd reason, especially on the official forums. I've actually perused the official forum time to time, and I do see a lot of people saying one of the biggest ones that I've seen recently is, that maces and mauls are actually really good for PvE because you don't always have Alkosh and you don't always have Crusher uptime, which to me is a bit of a head scratcher. Another similar thing when we're talking about Mundus stones, a lot of people say, well, you should be running the Lover because you shouldn't necessarily anticipate getting Alkosh or Crusher uptimes. And again, that sort of scratches my head a little bit. Why are people making these sort of recommendations? A lot of the endgame PvE players are also kind of scratching their heads about it. Yes, a lot of us are in sort of more organized groups, so we kind of have a better idea of debuff uptimes, things like that. We have higher debuff uptimes and buff uptimes, but even in these progression groups, we're not necessarily going to have 100% debuff uptime. So I think I thought I would just sort of kind of give my opinions on to how to kind of approach this sort of problem, so to speak, and kind of give you guys sort of an example of when you might want to consider one method over the other. So basically, the idea behind buffs and debuffs and building around it falls into basically two possibilities. The first one is you take the average buff and debuff uptimes, which is a fair approach because you obviously, especially in progression style groups, you don't necessarily have 100% uptime on your buffs and debuffs. It's a fair assumption to make. The other hand, you also want to consider what if I do have all my buffs and debuffs active, because there will be times in a fight where you have Major Force, you have Alkosh, you have Crusher going all at the same time. So even though they might not necessarily be up 100% of the fight, there are going to obviously be instances where all of your debuffs and all of your buffs are active at the same time. You kind of want to take that into consideration when you're making your build. So what do? Do you take into consideration the average, or do you take into consideration, well, what happens in the best case scenario when I have all my buffs and debuffs active? So from a theory crafting standpoint, me personally, I prefer taking sort of the average buff debuff uptimes, but a more realistic and I'd argue a slightly more accurate, or I should say, I don't want to say better, but it's kind of the only one that comes to mind here. The better way to kind of think of it is, what is it like when I have all my debuffs and buffs active? Because at that instance, you kind of have to take into consideration two things when it comes to your build. One, am I going to end up over penetrating? And two, is the loss. So basically, it all boils down to this: is the loss of DPS when all my debuffs and buffs are not active, is that going to be greater than or less than the DPS that I would lose if I were to overcompensate for when my buffs and debuffs are active? So a good example of this would be penetration. So back to the kind of examples that I've seen on the forums, a lot of people are saying, well, you won't expect 100% uptime on Alkosh, 100% uptime on Crusher in your typical 4-man dungeon or something like that, which is a fair assumption to make. That being said, though, you have to take this into consideration. If you decide to run the Lover and you have 7 Divines pieces, you'll have 4196 additional penetration. What if you have Alkosh and you have Crusher active? With the Lover, chances are you're going to be overpenetrating by a very large margin, anywhere between 2k to 4k, possibly even higher. So the question becomes, penetration only helps you so much. Once you have your penetration is above 18,200, it doesn't provide any additional DPS. So in that instance, the Lover is not providing any sort of additional DPS. Now, when those debuffs are not active, then obviously the Lover is providing a little bit of additional DPS that way. So the balance is the time that I'm overpenetrating using the Lover, is that loss in DPS because I'm overpenetrating, is that going to be greater than, less than, or equal to the amount of DPS that I would gain when those buffs and debuffs are not active? And that's a very hard question to answer. So there's a lot of sort of different camps and different thoughts about this. So to kind of give you guys an idea of buffs and debuffs, this is a parse that I did quite a while ago. This was back in 2018, actually. And this basically is more or less a raid parse. This is kind of the best case scenario, so to speak. This was a raid parse that we did with, I believe it was Hellfire Dominion here. And so you can see here that my max penetration is a little bit low, so it didn't quite meet the 18,200, but at the same time we also didn't have power of the light here. So I was assuming we'd have power of the light. Turns out we weren't going to have it. So in this case, I did end up adjusting my CPs. But you can see here that my mean is obviously not the same as my max. Line breaker, which is the Alkosh debuff, was only up 46% of the time because I believe with this we only had one tank running Alkosh. Pressure is up 100% of the time, major breach is up 100% of the time, minor vulnerability essentially 100% of the time, and in terms of buffs, major force is only up 41% of the time. And this is an ideal parse in our specific raid group. So this is on a dummy, nothing was happening, we have no mechanics, and nothing was happening there. So what do I do here? Do I take the 46% uptime on the Alkosh debuff and use that when I'm calculating out my penetration? Or do I take the full Alkosh debuff when I'm just trying to figure out my overall penetration? And again, this is not an easy question to answer because there's a lot of different factors that are involved in here. But generally speaking, while I personally like when I'm doing my mathematical calculations to take averages, in an actual raid scenario, I prefer to actually take what happens if all my buffs and debuffs are active at the same time. Generally speaking, that's a good scenario to kind of envision, because even though, yes, you won't get 100% uptime at Alkosh, this is, again, an idealized parse with one tank with multiple synergies that can only manage for 6% uptime on the Alkosh debuff. The Alkosh debuff is still going out, so again, you kind of want to balance that out. You want to balance out the DPS loss when your debuffs are up versus DPS gain when your debuffs are not up. And so a lot of these assumptions that people are making on the official forums on Reddit, that you will not have Alkosh, you will not have pressure, those are valid criticisms. Those are valid sort of views on how to deal with buffs and debuffs. But on the flip side, it is also completely inaccurate to say you will never have Crusher, you will never have Alkosh, and therefore you must run the lever, or you must run Sharpened, or what have you. Because the truth of the matter is, in an organized group, even in a semi-organized group, you will have these debuffs active at some point. So the question becomes, again, are you going to over-penetrate? Which is really the biggest factor here. It usually boils down to penetration. So, here in econometrics, there is a value for when you are going to end up over-penetrating here. So, if your over-penetration is very high, if you have spent a large part of your time, of your parse over-penetrating, then obviously the lever is not right, because you're not getting any sort of additional damage out of the lever. So again, this is a very difficult question to answer, but generally speaking, you should be making your builds around the assumption that you will have your buffs and debuffs active. While you are sort of making mathematical assumptions and sort of comparing sets, sure, you can use the average if you'd like, if you know your averages. But the truth of the matter is, even those averages in endgame groups can vary slightly, and that might shift the math one way or the other. So the most consistent way to make your build is look at the buffs you have in group, look at the debuffs you have in group, and assume that they're going to be active at all times. That'll probably give you the most consistent results out of your build. So that's basically my take on this whole use the lever on Magicka builds, because you're never going to get Crusher or you're never going to get Alkosh. That sort of thinking is, sure, it's fine if you don't run with the organized group. If you just run solo, if you pug solo dungeons, things like that, sure, go ahead and do that. But if you're at that level of play, if you're playing solo, if you don't have an organized group running dungeons, running pledges, running trials, you also have to question yourself, does this really matter for my level of play? And the truth of the matter is, for a lot of casual players like that, whether you're in the lever or the shadow doesn't really matter. It's not necessarily because your DPS is not necessarily going to be as high as us. It's just the fact that overland content and a lot of the dungeon content is actually fairly easy. If you're able to pull 20k or 25k, you can already clear pretty much all the dungeons in the game, even on vet hard mode. Perhaps some of the vet DLC dungeons might be a little bit more difficult because of mechanics involved and things like that, but in theory, 20 to 25k DPS is plenty to clear pretty much all the content in the game. And at that level of play, whether you run the lever or whether you run the shadow, whether you run sharpened, whether you run infused, at that level of play doesn't really matter, because no matter what, your DPS is going to either be good enough to clear the content or not good enough to clear the content. So the people who I have seen argue most that you'll never have Alkosh, you'll never have Crusher, tend to be those types of people, the casual players who are playing solo content, who are pugging by themselves without any friends or anything in Dungeon Finder, in which case I have to ask you guys the question. is this worth optimizing your DPS for? And the truth of the matter is, in most instances, it's not. And the people who are asking, should I run the lever? Should I run, should I run mauls or maces instead of greatswords? They're asking from a group DPS perspective. They're asking from a raid perspective, from an organized, semi-organized group perspective. So in that regard, you kind of have to take that context into consideration. So that's it for this sort of theory crafting video. Hope you guys found this informative. If you guys have any questions or comments about sort of the meta behind theory crafting, please feel free to ask any questions down in the comment section below. I hope you guys enjoyed this video, and I'll see you guys in the next dungeon.